Hello, dear friends, and welcome once again. Today we are here with yet again another dear friend of ours, Julio Padovan. We are here to discuss a little bit about an overview, a chat, a conversation about one of the books of the codification, Genesis. Julio, we are so happy you're here with us today, and you allowed us to interview you here today.
Oh, and thank you kindly for inviting me.
No, it's
pleasure.
wonderful. Julio, tell us a little bit about yourselves for our viewers, for our listeners who aren't yet familiar or acquainted with you, about your background.
Well, I'm Brazilian. I was born and raised, educated in Brazil. But now I'm here in the U.S. I live here. I've been living here in the U.S. for the past 18 years.
And you come from a scientific background, correct? Research and all?
That's correct, yes.
Tell us a little bit more about the specifics of that.
All right. I'm a chemist. I hold a degree in chemistry, a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of São Paulo. And I also have a Ph.D. degrees in biochemistry and molecular biology. And I'm currently affiliated to the Laboratory for Mass Spectrometry and Gas Design Chemistry at the Rockefeller University in New York City.
That's wonderful. Do you feel having that background has given you a different perspective when you have studied in depth the Genesis, and how has that played a part? Because for us, coming from a medical profession, we know that when we've read the books of André Louis, Mechanisms of Mediumship, it's sort of sparked something within us because we love our own profession. Do you feel like you've had the same experience?
Yes, it definitely helps, particularly Genesis, which is the most scientific of all the 5 books of the codification.
Right.
But it's important to say that every time we read, we don't read the 5 books of the codification once and we put them back onto the shelf. You have to read them over and over again, and every time you read, you realize that you have missed something, or that something you could have carried out a little further, could have developed a little further. But it definitely helps. It's
a new experience every time. I think it's that way for a lot of us,
yes.
No matter how many times we read something. And that's why we say these books, the books of the codification of André Louis, they're never books for leisure. You just pick up and then you say, oh, I've already read that once. It's a book to read for a lifetime, over and over again. We're kind of curious though, how did you come upon Spiritism?
Yes.
Everyone has their own story to tell. What's your story?
Just before I answer that, I actually like to say one thing.
Sure.
I like Poirot books, from Agatha Christie, and it's one thing that is interesting when you compare Spiritist books with, let's say, Agatha Christie's books. Once you read one of those, and you know who's done it, right?
Right.
You can't read it again because it's not much fun anymore. You already know the ending, but that's not the same with Spiritism. There is no end to it. So every time you read, and you read it over and over again, you discover things, new things that you didn't see before because you were not ready at the time. You had to build before, something else before, to be able to appreciate those things that you're seeing now. And there are things in the future when you're going to read it the next time.
Wow, that's amazing. And Agatha Christie books, for those of you who aren't familiar, that's a very famous series of books about mysteries.
Yeah, mysteries, yes. Whodunits.
Yes,
basically.
Exactly. And who wants to reread, the ending. Yes. It's fascinating. Tell us a little bit about, again, how you came upon Spiritism. How you found out about it, and your own personal story.
I was 15 years old, first year of high school, and I had a colleague who later became a friend in class that needs some assistance, and I started tutoring him. And he was raised by his grandparents, and his grandmother who's still alive. She is an extensive medium, and she met me at that day in the house, and later she mentioned that she got a very good vibration, let's put it this way, from me. And she eventually invited me over for their Gospel at Home sessions, and I started going. So as I said, I was 15 years old, so I started going. I took it very seriously because for me it was very important. I found some sort of serenity in this liaison between science and religion, which I hadn't been able to find. That was something that remained unfulfilled in my life at the time, even with the little knowledge that I had as an adolescent. So that was my beginning.
Julio,
in Spiritism, yeah.
It's a wonderful beginning. Tell us a little bit, because we were talking off air before about tell us the funny story of how the O-ring has sort of helped you to re-encounter Spiritism in New York, which is where you're from,
Okay.
or where you're currently residing.
Well, so I started going to this friend's house for the Gospel at Home. Then I started also visiting Spiritist centers, and this is in Brazil. Then I moved to the U.S. when by the age of 27. And here I didn't know anyone. I came here alone. I don't have any families here, family members here, relatives. And so I was just doing the Gospel at Home by myself. And for many years, that's how it remained. And one day I was searching about O-ring manufacturers for the lab where I work. You know, I needed to do a particular task, and I needed specific O-rings. And in the search from Google, one of the top entry was SGNY, the Spiritist Group of New York. And I realized, oh, there's a Spiritist Center here in New York. Not that I didn't know that one did not exist, but it somehow caught my eye. And I decided to visit. And I've been there since then, since 2007, 2008.
All because of an O-ring search. It's fascinating how we come upon these things. But what we are primarily here today is to talk about the Genesis. Could you tell us a little bit about, in the codification, because we know that there are 5 main books in the codification, where the Genesis is at within that 5 codification, and how it plays a part in that basic 5.
Okay, so I would like to start with a disclaimer.
Yes.
Okay, so you will apologize, but I'm very partial to this book. This is very dear to me because this is the book that I would never, ever mention to anyone who's beginning in Spiritism, who's starting in Spiritism. That I would never use this book as the first book to read, as the starting book.
Right.
But yet, that was my case. That was the first book I read. And that's what brought me into Spiritism. So it's very dear to me. So Genesis is the 5th book of the codification, as we know it. The last book Kardec wrote of the 5, you know, in the sense of establishing a foundation for us. Mm-hmm. And it's the most scientific of all the 3 books. I mean, there are many ways you can look at the book, of course. It's not that there is no philosophy or that there is no religious part in it, but you know, the 3 pillars of Spiritism: religion, science, and philosophy. But we start actually a lot with science. Actually, we start with the religious part, and we go a little bit into philosophy, but then the most part of the book is actually science. We could say, basically, let's say, almost 2/3 of it is science, and the other 1/3 is divided roughly between religion and philosophy.
Could you give us a brief overview of how the book is actually broken up?
Sure. So Kardec starts briefly talking about God. So it starts to position the Creator, mm-hmm. With respect to everything else. And so that we have basically 2-3 chapters about the Creator, about the idea of what is considered good, what is considered evil. And then we start with the universe, the creation of the universe, then the creation of solar systems, the planets, and from the planets we go into the creation of life in each one of these planets. It's basically a circle. Imagine that you start with the creation, the Creator here. The Creator is the beginning of everything, and then you go first through you have to create the physics, then you create the chemistry. So when you say physics, it's the universe. It's everything, the laws, that's the universe. Then you move to the chemistry when you start creating the atoms, and here is where you're going to start putting together. So now you don't have the laws in the universe, but now you're using this to create the first particles, or the first pieces of the puzzle. From the chemistry, you move to the geology. Now you started creating the geology, but in this case, much more amplified. Not geology just for geo, Earth, but actually the whole birth of, let's say, stars and planets. Once you get to planets, you start putting life. You go to biology. Then you develop that life into sentience. that humanity in our case. And from that sentience, we are capable of understanding God. It's the psychological part. And you close this whole circle that started with the Creator, moved through physics, chemistry, then geology or astrogeology, if I could use that word, and it doesn't exist. And then biology, then we have the sentience, psychology, and back to the Creator.
Julio, can we ask you, or can we throw you a curveball question?
We'll try. You can try. I don't know if I'll be able to answer it.
How important, for those who might be thinking this question, how important is this knowledge for us to know in regards to making us a better person?
Okay, that's actually a very good question. A lot of people say, well, I don't have a scientific background, so
Right.
I shouldn't worry about Genesis. I don't have a scientific background, therefore I won't be able to understand. And why do I need to know science to be charitable, for instance? Whenever we talk about science, people have very specific views of it. One thing is that they're going to open Genesis and they'll have to do a math problem, or a physics problem, or a chemistry problem.
Right.
It's not that. When we say science here, we want to get a better understanding, a better rationale for things around us. So instead of just blurting it out, oh yes, we have to love everybody, we have to love one another, which is true, it is true, but we try to give reasons for it. So in that sense, the science is a beautiful foundation for love, for charity, for all the other things, for instance, that we see more in the religious part of the doctrine, which is actually found particularly in the gospel.
So what you're talking about, it's that rationalized, unshakable faith that we are led to, that we're not just blindly like cattle following something simply because we hear it.
Exactly, exactly. We have this idea of faith of something that is blind. And what Kardec tries to abolish completely, or let's say reinvent, is a complete different type of faith.
Right.
It's a faith that is founded on very solid, very sturdy ground. A faith that asks questions, that it's not only that a faith that asks questions, but a faith that allows questions to be asked.
Yes.
And allows individuals to go after the answers. Yes, that's very important.
Without fear of persecution,
Without
or being
fear.
shot down.
Exactly, or the idea of dogmas, or the idea that you reach a point and we say, no, this belongs to God. We don't have this approach in Spiritism. We understand that there are certain things that we cannot understand, we cannot grasp right now. That is true. It's like a staircase. You can't get to the last step if you don't take the intermediate steps. But we are not precluded from asking, or from at least imagining, or even speculating about the last step.
It's the beauty of
Yeah.
Spiritism.
There's no heresy in it. There's
Right.
no disrespect in it.
Right.
The problem is when people become very fixated. I'll try to avoid the idea of saying obsessed, because we have a different meaning for that in
Right.
Spiritism. So fixated with finding the answer of the last step without knowing the answers of the intermediate steps. But there's nothing wrong about asking about it.
The beauty of Spiritism.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about spiritual fluids. We know that in the Genesis they go into that, and we know that you're familiar with that, and you've given many talks about that. Talk to us about spiritual fluids. Just a little overview about it.
Overview. All right.
Yes.
So if we're going to talk about overview, let's talk about the fluid, the
Okay.
universal cosmic fluid.
Right.
So we see the way we understand right now, our current knowledge of things that allows us to move forward, is that we have the Creator, and then we have the creation. Two distinct things. Of course, the creation came from the Creator. And the creation may be divided. This is a division that is didactic, purely didactic. We are not talking about anything here has to be, so separated. We have the spiritual principle,
Okay.
and that will give rise to spirits and so on. And we also have now the second one, the universal cosmic fluid. This is what gives rise to matter, for instance, and all other things, antimatter, energy, dark energy, all things. But we are more concerned with energy and matter, because these are the things we have in our daily lives here in the physical realm. So this fluid, universal cosmic fluid, is what is used by the Spirit to manipulate and create our spiritual body or perispirit, and also our physical body. So different manifestations of it, different manipulations of it will yield our perispirit, which is a lot more ethereal than our physical body, which is the other type of manipulation.
Okay, that's really interesting. So if someone were to come and ask you, how does this information play a part in their day-to-day lives? How should they utilize this information? I know during many talks you've given about the spiritual fluids in general. Mm-hmm. To utilize this information in a more specific way in our day-to-day lives, is there a specific perspective we should have on these fluids, and what responsibility do we have? Not just as spiritists, but anyone who believes in these ideas, because they're universal ideas, right? What is my position and responsibility before this knowledge and information?
So I won't scare anyone with the E equals mc squared formula from Einstein. So when we say that the universal cosmic fluid actually gives rise to matter, to energy, and so many other things, different manifestations of it, right? We're not interested in that part. Actually, the universal cosmic fluid is what we, the spirits, use to interact, basically, with the creation, with the universe. We are part of the creation, but we used to interact even with among ourselves, other spirits. We have to understand that when we say we are the spirits, we are the intelligence. We are we have the free will. These are all in the spirit: the free will, the conscience, the intelligence. But then we need a vehicle to express ourselves. That's the universal cosmic fluid. So why is it important for a spiritist to understand? Because everything from mediumistic phenomena all the way to, for instance, our health, the health of the physical body, our physical body itself, it's all part of the universal cosmic fluid. Manipulations, interactions of our spirit with that universal cosmic fluid.
That is a great segue for me, because we really wanted to, our next question for you is, how does fluids play into illness and our health?
Oh, okay. I think the best way to explain that is to use a couple of different scenarios. So, like I said before, we the spirits, right? We have now we interact with this universal cosmic fluid. Here we have a little problem, and I'll take a little time to explain, because I cannot say, for instance, that we could use an analogy, for instance, saying that the spirit manipulates the universal cosmic fluid like clay. So it makes a little statue. And that's not a bad analogy. But we have to understand that there is no physicality to the universal cosmic fluid.
Okay.
So when we say clay, that's why I have a little bit of a problem with that analogy. We cannot say, for instance, that the spirit molds or shapes the universal cosmic fluid, because again, that implies a physicality. So I like the expression, it wills over the universal cosmic fluid.
Oh, nice.
Spirits, all of us, we will over the universal cosmic fluid. Then you're going to say, well, that's wonderful, but it's an empty expression. Well, we don't know exactly how it's done, not at our level. So we can speculate, but then we have to be careful. We have to always keep in mind that it's a speculation. So let's keep this verb, will over, in the sense of we are molding it, we are shaping it, but without the physicality. So when we will over the universal cosmic fluid, we create, we give rise to our perispirit, our spiritual body. And this perispirit will then pass that information on. That is the original copy. It will create another copy, which is our physical body. Now, when we create our perispirit, our spirit is associated with animated matter. Our spirit will not associate itself with inanimate matter to create our perispirit. Right. Animated matter, in its turn, is made of matter, inanimate matter, and the vital fluid, or the vital principle. And this is key for us to understand. So now we have vital principle associated with matter, creating animated matter, which allows the animated matter and the spirit to interact. So now the spirit can will over the animated matter to create perispirit and later physical body. And why is that important? Let's say now someone with a physical body, someone that is as an incarnate being,
Okay.
is sick.
Okay.
And we see some cases where the individual recovers.
Right.
And in some cases the individual doesn't. So let's say, for instance, that the individual recovers while he's still here in the physical plane. Let's say also, let's look at a constructive point of view, that the individual has the particular disease, has an infirmity, and the individual does work very hard to improve himself or herself.
Right.
And so, in this case, what happens is that the spirit, which is actually where the infirmity is, the spirit doesn't have, for instance, a broken arm, or the spirit doesn't have a malfunctioning heart, because the spirit doesn't have a heart or an arm. But what happens is the spirit has some lack of knowledge that prevents it from manipulating the universal cosmic fluid and creating a better arm or a better heart during that incarnation process, for that incarnation process. So let's say that the spirit now corrects itself, learns and corrects that little lack of knowledge that it has. So now, once it wills over its perispirit, if there is still enough vital fluid, vital principle left, then that individual already received the cure during this reincarnation process. If not, the individual may pass on, may go back to the spiritual realm, either because of the disease itself or because of old age or some other complication. And then when it moves back into the spiritual realm, and now it loses the physical body, so now it's just spirit, perispirit, it becomes a dyad as opposed to a triad. Mm-hmm. Now that spirit no longer has that infirmity in its core, so the perispirit is also cured, so to speak.
This really brings us to another aspect within the Genesis, miracles.
Miracles, yes.
We see throughout, and we don't want to go too much in depth because of time and many other things, but the idea of miracles, so there are, according to Spiritism, there are no miracles. All things can be explained, right?
That's correct. So we see in this particular case that it's not a miracle. Miracles are basically things that we cannot explain at the moment.
Okay.
It's a lack of knowledge. And instead of being humble enough to admit to it, we just say, oh, it's a miracle. Because it's a lot easier to admit to God than to say to ourselves, well, I don't understand this, or I don't understand that. But the truth is, and there is a particular chapter in Genesis, one of the last chapters, where Kardec discusses it, that there are no miracles, and uses some of them, some of the miracles as we see them, that were carried out by Jesus himself, as a man Jesus, when we see that today, in the light of Spiritism, that they were not miracles. Like the resurrection of Lazarus, right, which at the time he was, we could say it's a catatonic state, and they didn't know it. The population didn't know it because of lack of biological information.
Right.
So we see things like that. The same thing applies to our diseases. That individual that got cured in the example that I gave. And then you might ask, but why is it that some individuals don't get the cure when they are here? Right? Just to finish that example too. Well, if that spirit deserves that cure, but there isn't enough vital fluid left during that reincarnation process, either because of the debilitating state that the disease brought, or because it's at the end of that reincarnation process, then the individual will perish because of that disease and go back to the spiritual realm. But when it goes back to the spiritual realm, because the spirit was got rid of that lack of knowledge, filled it with knowledge, now that perispirit is no longer infirm. So we don't have the miracle in the first case where the person got cured already here, and we don't have the absence of divine justice in the second case that allowed the individual to perish because of the infirmity, because we only see the physical life, but the truth is we have to see the whole picture. So even that second individual who did not receive, let's say, a miracle cure, that individual, when it goes back as to the spiritual realm, it goes back completely cured, because its spirit no longer has the infirmity or the deformity.
And that's a difficult concept for any of us to accept, especially
Very difficult.
if we go through an illness or chronic illness or cancer. It's a very difficult concept to grasp because of the emotional components that are connected with it. But we know that there is a difference between a cure and healing. And sometimes
that's right.
what we see with our physical body, we think that to be absent of disease means that we're completely healthy, which isn't always necessarily true, because we can have a physically healthy body, but our mind and spirit, just speaking, we are not. So sometimes it's just the experience, would you say, that some of us have to go through of experiencing an illness, whether chronic, acute, or cancer, or whatever it is, for our immortal souls?
Yes. It's very difficult for us to try to get a rationale.
Because
and
every case is different.
Every case is
a
different,
case.
and we can also we should also be very careful not to avoid going around pointing at people and say, oh, that person has this disease, must have done this and that in the previous life, or that the other individual has this or that disease, just must have done this or that. We can't have these direct correlations. We have to live our lives in the present. You have a disease, you work with it. Now you helped me, because when you mentioned this is the importance. This is the importance of reading Genesis, particularly the scientific part, because now we understand how the universal cosmic fluid, what role this universal cosmic fluid plays in our lives. We understand that we can will over it. And this is the part that will help us when we go through a difficult moment. Because when you're sick, okay, love is important. Love is not just important, but we all want it. But the truth is, understanding will help us much more than love itself. The love that we get from family members, from relatives, from friends, not the absolute love. That absolute love encompasses everything. Not talk about the absolute love, because we don't even have the ability to understand. But when we are going through a disease, the understanding of the whole process will help us a lot more. Because if I'm going through some infirmity, and you help me as a friend, and you give me assistance, and you'll be there, you're holding my hand, the truth is, if I'm a bitter person because I don't have that understanding, all that love that you're giving to me is important, and it's also good for you, because but I am impervious to it. I have a barrier, put up, and I'm not. You are trying to send it to me, but I am not receiving it. I'm denying it to myself. So the understanding will bring that barrier down, that psychological barrier. That bitterness will go away, and I will see that disease not as a punishment, like most people like to say, yes, you're suffering because you did this or that. No, but I will see that as a moment of progress in my life that I have to deal with it at that moment. That's it. Right. So the understanding helps a lot.
It's a very delicate area, right, Julio? Because we always say tread lightly, and being a spiritist, having a little bit of knowledge, having a lot of knowledge is not a license to judge. And we're so happy that you said that, because we always try to reinforce that this is not an opportunity for us to go around pointing fingers, judging people, or even assuming or creating ideas in our mind to say, well, if this person's going through this, it's because they did that. That is not the purpose of Spiritism. You touched on what it is. The importance of Spiritism is, as an individual, my personal responsibility before God and before my incarnation to find out what my purpose is. Independent of what's going on around me. What is my purpose in my life? How can I leave this world a better person? And what can I contribute to society around me? Julio, just to sort of finalize, we really wanted to get your, if it's even possible, major highlight on the Genesis, if you have one.
On the Genesis, I would say there are a few points that are important when you read it. I would not worry about the part that talks about God, because we have a whole section in the Spirit's book, and the gospel is dedicated to God itself. So it wouldn't be fair just to use a tiny little chapter of I think 2 pages or 3 pages that is present in Genesis. So what I would say that's important in Genesis is when you look at the universe, the way it's described, even with the sparse amount of details, that were available to Kardec at the time. So when we read Genesis, we even think that we're reading a history book in terms of the science, because today we know so much more.
Right.
But even with all that, you realize how beautiful the mechanism is, how complex it is, not complicated, complex. And one other important aspect is that we have a tendency to think of the universe out there and ourselves over here, and we are separated from it. And it's not like that. As Joanna Janges like to say, observer, ourselves, and observe the universe, they commingle, they're intertwined. We can't extricate one from the other. If we pull ourselves from the universe, it's no longer the universe. It's the universe missing something, missing us. So we are all together in this. This is very clear in Genesis, throughout the scientific part, that we are a piece of this beautiful, if I dare say, clockwork mechanism. Clockwork in the most celestial of the meanings, if we can find some way of defining it today. I think that's the most important part. And more towards the end, the fact that we try to move away from the mysticism, the idea of the miracles, the idea of that there's something that can derogate the divine laws. The divine laws are perfect. If we accept the idea of a miracle, whether through a spiritual fluid or through any type of justification that we might give to ourselves, if we accept the idea of a miracle, then we have to accept the idea that God, the Creator, is flawed, because it's possible to derogate one of its laws, even if only temporarily. If only temporarily, that means the law has a flaw. So these 2 points, I would say, that the universe is so beautiful, that we are part of it, we cannot extricate ourselves from it, and the idea that there are no miracles. If you read the book and you get these 2 points, I would say you understood the most important aspects of it.
That's beautiful, Julio. We love that you brought that as the highlight, because we know, and it almost seems counterintuitive, but in actuality, what you're talking about is what I believe it was either Andrea Louise or Emmanuel in the opening of the book, Evolution in Two Worlds. One of the most beautiful things to this day, we love that book, because they basically say that book are for those, and I'm paraphrasing, are for those who are suffering. When you read the book, you think to yourself, it's very scientific. How in the world? Because most times we look at the Gospel according to Spiritism as a consoling book. And we look at the Genesis not as a book of consolation, but in fact, in actuality, it is. Why is it? Because when we take ourselves out for a moment of our problems, which are oftentimes or sometimes serious or not, or whatever it is the case, but when we are able to open up our mind and broaden it, it gives us a new perspective, a new lease on life. And when we read the Genesis, it also reminds us, once again, how big our universe is and how small and short our life here on Earth is. And also in the book Evolution Two Worlds, we see how intricate and in depth and time that God puts into making this vast universe. And Julio, if you have any final tips for our listeners, our viewers, that you could share, a take-home message.
I would say open Genesis, read it. Since we're talking about Genesis, and it's part of the talk about fluid, read Genesis. Do not be afraid that it's filled with science, because like you very well put it, it will help us, especially when we are suffering. There are 2 levels of suffering. There is the level of suffering when we talk about physical pain. That's the first thing that we always think. When it says suffering, it means some sort of physical pain. Even if you say, oh, I lost my job, but this is not a physical pain. No, it is, because you start having gastritis, acid reflux, you don't sleep at night. It manifests physically, right? So we want that to go away. So the physical pain, it's not the whole thing. We have to understand that there's something else that is behind it, and that is what we have really to attack, to correct. That's in our spirit. This is where the books will help us, and the understanding will help us. The other thing that, when you said it's a book for suffering, it's the psychological aspect. We actually suffer the most when we reach crossroads in our lives, when we want to learn and we don't know how, we are a little scared of taking road A, road B, or C, and so on. And these books will help us. The scientific part will help us. Like I said, it's not a math problem, but in the sense of showing how intricate the universe is, and that the truth is there is no real good choice. There are just choices. As long as we own up to all the consequences of each of one of our choices, we are always on the right path. So read Genesis. Do not be afraid of it just because of a mention of how a planet's put together, because you're not reading about how the planet is going to be put together. There will be no test after that. It's for you to see how big the creation actually is and how big you are, since you are. So we all are a piece of it.
Right. And that is truly consoling for us,
Yes.
believe it or not. And we wanted to leave you with these thoughts, with these ideas. We wanted to encourage our viewers, our listeners, to go to do more studies, more inner enlightenment, because that's what we're here, that's what we're talking about. That's what we believe is important. It is this inner enlightenment, finding time in our day-to-day lives, making it a priority. So, dear viewers, dear listeners, we encourage you to embark upon this journey of studying the Genesis, the whole codification. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at the Spiritist Society of Baltimore or leave your comment below. And until next time, we wish you many blessings. And thank you, Julia, once again for being with us here today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for listening.
God bless.